Hey folks, Steve here with another video covering Pitt's War, we'll say grand strategic, or really zoomed out strategic, maybe is the right word, coverage of the Napoleonic period, stretching from 1792, meaning the War of the First Coalition, all the way to 1815. This is a magazine game designed by Francois Stanislaw Thomas, and I could be slightly mispronouncing that based on his French background, I believe, if I understand correctly. This is a, we'll say, simplified version in many respects to Nations in Arms, and so serves as kind of a magazine format conversion where a lot of rules are kind of streamlined, flattened out to be able to be played on a single map with really not that many counters. You can see there's a fair number on the map, but it's not really that many in the grand scheme of things. There's a few counters off to the side that are in the force pools. There's a whole bunch of random activity markers that are for like event chits that are off camera as well. But there's really not that many counters, which makes this game kind of a lightweight experience. Now, I have tried to play this before when I was on some personal travel, and I got through almost the way through the Revolutionary period, which is a big stretch of the game, mind you. Before I had to wrap up, and I can tell you that I probably was getting some things wrong. Both the French and the coalition sides benefited from me accidentally putting some units into the force pool earlier than they should have been in there, which really had a lot to do with me not reading the reinforcement schedule ahead of time to see that some stronger versions of units enter the game and replace other units, which I believe means they just exit the game at that point. So there was some weirdness. It wasn't played quite right, and we ended up with some odd results because of how well the French faction was doing during the Revolutionary period. That things got a little bit wonky. So I'm going to be trying to play through this pretty quickly. So for this video, I'll just talk about the end result of each turn as I go through it, or rather, what I'm going to do is after each 3-year changeover for the event markers, we'll talk about that. Now, I talked in that previous video on how like the game works for the most part. It's a pretty straightforward game experience. As you activate units, you roll a die, so you have variable movement based on the die roll and the quality of the units. You can move that many spaces on the map. You can engage in combat, various things, and you do eventually conquer territory, and you can set up things like the Confederation of the Rhine and so on and so forth. Um, it's really an interesting run at it, at this whole experience. It's probably the only, as far as I know, it's the only really playable game that actually bothers to give you a 1792 to 1815 combined campaign. Nations in Arms has a separation, so you can play the War of the First Coalition, some of the War of the Second Coalition, and then you have to kind of jump ahead of the Third Coalition for that campaign game. The War of the First Coalition is actually a great experience in that game in terms of just being able to play that. You can do that here as well, which is really interesting. And the designer has tried to bake in the same sort of narrative set of events that govern the War of the First Coalition in a pretty good manner here. But again, it's the only game that actually fuses that across the board. I suspect this is because the designer hadn't quite figured out how he wanted to do that progression. It was only after the publication of Nations in Arms did that really click. I'm not 100% that's the production order of things, but it feels that way, right? If Nations in Arms has learned from War and Peace, and obviously the designer kind of learned from Nations in Arms, tried to bake in some things to give you an experience here. Now, this is definitely just a two-player game, which means we're not dealing with any weird multiplayer oddities and carrots and sticks that make multiplayer games in the Napoleonic era like never be historical. This is going to be pretty much on some sensical lines of history. And again, the event markers are what really drive that, and we'll be pulling those from cups. Those change over the years, so sometimes we're going to need to like pull some chits out, put new chits in, and the actual action that's caused by the chit is in the rules, so we got to look those up. But generally, the game plays pretty well based on my initial impressions video, if you saw that. And I'm just going to play through it again here, right? So probably for the first several clips, we're just going to be running through again the War of the First Coalition, see what is different. We'll eventually transition to the War of the Second Coalition, where Russia enters the fray, and of course Napoleon will enter the scene and start to affect the game state and situation over time. The one thing to watch out for, just worth mentioning, is I think when we talk about Nations in Arms, as well as the new War and Peace 7th edition, where cards are being used to help drive a narrative, and getting the right mix of when are you getting cards, when are you using the cards, are you not drawing enough of the right cards to make the difference that you want to have. While I'm still going to look to discover if War and Peace 7th edition manages to do a good job there. I think, just based on my last play of Pitt's War, um, did I say the game at the beginning of the video? It's Pitt's War. That's the name of the video. It's Pitt's War here. I think Pitt's War manages to do a pretty good job of smoothing that out, because there's some thought put to the number of chits that are added to the cup when they leave the cup, what chits stick around over time, um, and how many you actually draw, which is controlled by the game turn track. So, based on how many chits are still left, you're going to have a planned for set of odds as to how often or how soon you're going to pick up some of these chits, in particular the ones that have a really strong narrative, like core juncture point to them, like the treaty, or the Peace of Basel, not sure the right way to pronounce that, where Prussia and Spain left the War of the First Coalition. When that chit comes up is important. There is some variability to it, but it, you would think it will eventually come up. And I think it's better calibrated again than Nations in Arms. I'm not sure about War and Peace yet, guys. We're still waiting for some errata to cook on that, which is part of the reason why I'm playing this and maybe not that at the moment. So, okay, really pretty long intro here, guys, more than I intended. There are minors, there are various powers here. As we get playing through, we'll address that. The big thing here is, in representing the War of the First Coalition, we start with some malices as the French. They don't get their bonuses. They're really just that like fresh green revolutionary army. We need to use our Valmy chit and eventually our Carnot chit to get our bonuses that will help us fight back, allow us to use our volunteers to kind of boost our steps on the board, because the way this narrative should kind of work out is France starts in decent shape, but has to deal with Vendée rebels, Chouan's rebels, the Federalistes. Probably pronouncing that wrong. All these sort of like anti-revolution partisans are gonna populate and show up, and Britain will join the conflict, and things just keep getting more intense over time. So there's this sort of like peak where France gets to do a bunch of extra recruiting, which is balanced against all the fronts that it's fighting at this point, and then it'll sort of settle into, so long as France didn't have a disaster, we'll eventually be able to cook off some of our opponents and eventually reach the end of the revolutionary period and start to pivot into the Napoleonic period proper. It should be noted, like at this point at the very beginning of the game, really the forces that are active on the coalition side amount to basically Austria and Prussia. And so the Austrians have their forces over here. They also control Piedmont. If you're familiar with the period, this is not going to sound terribly surprising or different. And then Prussia, also has an active army with Brunswick there in the Rhine region, where we're going to see some things kind of, burst into action very quickly. So 1792, it's just France versus Prussia and Austria, basically. However, in 1793, Spain enters the fray, as does Britain, as does all of their buddies like the Netherlands and Naples. And so, you just, again, you get this cascading set of events that the players are having to grapple with. And I find it very interesting. That's why I like the War of the First Coalition and Nations in Arms so much, because if you know the history, like it is this interesting narrative of powers entering the conflict, leaving the conflict. France kind of being on its heels, but being able to stabilize, and being able to implement that in a game at this level is really fascinating to me. So kudos that again we reach for the stars a little bit here with some game content you don't normally see in other games. Of course, War and Peace now is covering War of the First Coalition and Second Coalition, but again, those seem to be broken up scenarios and not quite the full grand campaign of this one. So we're gonna play through 1792, 1793, and then 1794. Compared to the game state you see here, right? Like this isn't going to change. Probably going to leave these guys here. We don't want to leave an open front against the Spanish, so those guys will stick. We'll probably push, as France into northern Italy, or at least try. And then we're going to see the French really try to mop up Flanders, deal with the Prussians, and then tango with the Austrians as they come up through southern Germany. That will progress to now having to fight on the additional fronts. And then uh, in also 1793, we're going to be dealing with, again, those partisans. So like it'll quickly become difficult. And then in 1794, we do start to see more of the Polish partitioning happening over in the east, which the coalition player actually does have to keep in mind and keep some steps in Poland to keep that under control. So again, these different sort of balancing elements will play through. When we come back from the cut, it will be the beginning of 1795, and may indicate kind of how much in trouble France is, with the hope that Napoleon will show up and help to make a big difference there. So I'll go play through that and those three turns, and then we'll show the aftermath here. Okay, here we are at the end of 1794. I haven't touched anything to get us into 1795, but that will be a switch over of various chits. So new chits will come in. Some chits are going to leave. Potentially, I need to kind of sort through all of that. But both sides, I mean, this is already looking really good for the French, as you can see. But it wasn't this way the entire time. I think the French have a couple of advantages in that they have more than one leader on the board. Now, that's not for want of trying. The coalition side used every marker they could to try to kill or remove Dumouriez, and it didn't happen. Now, on odds, they probably should have gotten one of them to work, and they just never came up that way, which has meant that Dumouriez has been able to stay in charge of the big French army, has been able to kind of, dance swords with Brunswick to, a lot of the time it was uh, kind of neck and neck at dancing around Flanders and the Palatinate, trying to outmaneuver each other and recover from combats and that sort of thing. And really, I think the French have were slightly winning out, and then this last turn, the odds kind of went against the Prussians at sort of the last couple of combats here pretty significantly. And in fact, Brunswick had to just pull back to Prussia proper, because he was getting in kind of an untenable situation. He could have stayed where he was, but the French were going to go after him, and could have, though it ended up not working out that way, could have rolled well enough on movement to get into Berlin as the final move of the turn, which catastrophic. So Brunswick had to pull back. That sort of ceded much of Germany to French control. You can see there in the north, South Germany, the Empire provinces, Hessia, the Netherlands, though that's not really part of Germany, as well as Hanover and Saxony, for that matter, have all been converted to French control, which that's exactly where the French would love to be at this point in the game. In Italy, most of Italy has been converted to French control. Naples was taken out early with our Alps corps that stomped down there and managed to achieve victory. There were some attempts to make something happen here with Sardinia. The chits played out that that wasn't going to be how it occurred. The French managed to get into Mantua and are pressuring the Austrians, which is why the Austrians have a reserve garrison in um, their capital with their German army kind of locked in place. If that German army were to go on the offensive or get kind of set off on a bad path, the French Italian army might have been able to march into Vienna. And so that really stopped any coalition push into southern Germany, though the coalition remains in control of Bavaria at this point. Um, so, uh, Also, I should mention Spain. Uh, that was really, really quiet for a long time until after all the Vendée rebels and stuff had been cleared up. We decided to take a risk. We started to push over here. We used our Toulon shit that hadn't been used anywhere else to help push our way through. So Spain doesn't have any units on the board right now. The French are actually occupying several provinces, which puts Spain in a really bad position. And really, the coalition needs to stop Spain from being, either conquered or something else. Granted, you can see the rest of France is kind of empty right now, but Hoke has three steps in Paris, and he's sort of the last reserve to use here until more things kind of play out. So as we end the first 3 years, I'd say while it didn't turn the French favor probably until 1794, the French are kind of ahead. Probably not as catastrophically ahead as they were the last time I played this, but it's still lining up to pretty consistent French advantage. Um, they're going to have to, the coalition's going to have to come to grips with how they can go on the offensive again. Austria is going to be a big part of that. Prussia, less so. We're going to reach the point where Prussia will leave the game soon. Austria is going to have to shoulder the burden. And then, we'll kind of go from there. We should expect the second coalition to come into fruition here before too long. So the Russians will certainly help things. Um, but the French have kind of succeeded out. They were topped off on their steps at the beginning of the last turn. They're losing their overflow for steps, but the French now don't have any real malices on their counters. They have a bunch of penalties at the beginning. Well, those have all cooked off or been addressed with markers, which means step for step, the French are usually going to be better off for almost the rest of the game at this point. Um, so let me go play 1795, 96, and 97. Napoleon's going to show up. Suvorov's going to show up. We'll have to make some decisions about Egypt potentially, but those are going to be important things to factor in. So we'll come back at the end of 1797 with the latest and the greatest situation, which would be historically lined up with the end of the War of the First Coalition, basically. So we'll see how it rolls. Okay, here we are at the end of 1797, and being the end of the historical War of the First Coalition, I'd say the French are doing very well. They've won that part of the conflict. Um, so the quick summary of any and all things here is over the course of the last couple of turns, the French player was able to get the event chits to peace out Prussia, peace out Spain, though there was a tough go of it up here in northern Spain that maybe could have gone either way. The fact that they were firmly not on French territory is what mattered. And we sort of pieced them out as the French player, which really left Britain and Austria as the prime opponents, which, the key thing is, rather than try to push for some kind of conquer state on Spain or Prussia, while that can be very powerful, it just in terms of balancing pressure, it's great to just say they're done. Now, I had to make an assumption rules wise that despite France having conquered Hesha, Haitians and the Saxons, that when you play the chit, the piece of Bessel, um, that those two countries revert to neutrality with Prussia, because that is despite them being conquered, that is what the event marker does. And the event marker, at least in the wording of the rules, the best as I can tell, trumps up the conquered state, because event markers can change the diplomatic status of a country. And again, the event marker stated, and the French player was willing to accept this, that those two minors go neutral with Prussia, which is fine. We will conquer them eventually as France, I am sure. So they're out until 1804. Spain just gets, they go put into a peace treaty there. Actually, what actually happened was Spain becomes an ally of France, but the coalition player had a chit that forced Spain into neutrality if they were allied to France. So you can kind of get, it's weird, it's based on the markers coming out. There's a possibility that France can enjoy a Spanish alliance for a little while, but that chit will eventually come up, and the British player, is going to probably want to use that to keep Spain under control. Now you'll also notice in the midst of all of that, towards the tail end, I did get an Irish expedition sent off, and I don't really have a full marker on here denoting it, but both, the Dublin and Belfast locations have been taken control of by the French. So long term, it basically, here's the problem: we have a whole unit up here that we're never going to see again, because I don't know how I'm going to get them back with naval transport. We don't really have naval capacities. So I sacrificed a step. It was just a single step, but it's really two steps that would otherwise be in Europe, mainland Europe, holding Ireland, which is a key, and this will affect the British production a little bit later in the game. So whether or not this was really the best move, I don't know. But I decided to go for it because we wanted to take a chance. It turned out at that moment the British player, the coalition player, didn't have a chit that could block a French naval invasion. So heck, why not? Now, right now, the British are basically keeping the fight alive by pressuring out of Sardinia, or not Sardinia, Sicily, and trying to, walk over to Naples. The French have managed to get some forces down there. Hoke, Hoche, who's been, one of the better leaders. We're going to lose him, but the force that is at the bottom of Italy is still sufficient to kind of hold the line there over time. So we're not super worried about it. The way that the naval stuff works, the French can never really get into Sicily. I don't think there's a Sicily expedition. You can't cross a strait into an enemy controlled zone. So you can walk from Palermo to this region, because unless there's a French unit there, it's just a blank zone. If you put a French unit there, then the British can't. Um, but the French can never come over here because it's always under control due to the city. So there's this, that's my interpretation of it. Basically, the British, if nothing else, can always pressure Italy and force the French to respond. And if they're tied up fighting Prussia and Austria or Russia, obviously they'll have fewer forces with which to do that with. So a little, levers and pulleys there, guys. Now, otherwise, we were fighting Austria, and basically lots of benefits went to Austria to kind of be the main fighting force on the continent. There was the advantage of Archduke Charles, who's currently on the turn track, to denote when the mandatory peace is over. Because what had happened was, while the Austrians were putting up a pretty great fight, Napoleon showed up and he made a pretty great difference. And while I think the French were doing probably a little bit better than history, where they didn't need Napoleon to like clean up northern Italy, like Napoleon entered the scene and basically marched on Austria from Italy, that was fairly and firmly in French hands at that point. So Austria, while it fought hard and maybe could have had a chance to fend off the French, it really got picked apart, and had to sign a peace, so a mandatory peace. The French did have the Campo Formio event chit, which would like temporarily peace out the Austrians for a year, but they ended up not needing it. It was like, well, we could play that, and it would put everything on ice, or we just push, see if we can push and actually conquer Austria, which is what happened. So we forced them to give us these Venetian provinces, and I might not have played that all the way right, but I think that's appropriate. We maybe could have taken Tyrol from them as well, but that's not a huge deal to me. I'm happy to let them, you know, kind of get. I don't want to like overly imbalance the game or something, but so Austria got pieced out in 1796, and in 1797, you can see they're starting to rebuild their forces. Technically, they should still have uh, their leader, but again, I'm just using him as a marker, a mnemonic. He'll go back on to probably the Italian army or the German army when the time comes. So better than history, right? Like not only did we temporarily peace out Austria, but the French forces have outright defeated a major power, which means that Britain is standing alone for the moment. This is significant. What this really allows the French player to do is consolidate control, kind of set up its forces how it likes. And I do have Napoleon set up over here in Marseille, expecting that as we go into the next 3 year period, 1798, that we're going to draw the Egypt expedition. And unless we get navally blocked, I think I will try to go into Egypt. I've not done that in this game yet, so that's kind of an exciting opportunity to try out that part of the game. We will need to watch for Russia to enter the fray, but here's the thing. Because we knocked Austria out completely, and they're not really going to be back until um, Austria won't enter the fray until late in this 3 year period. It's entirely possible that we'll have Russia enter the side of the coalition and like not be able to get anywhere, and in fact probably be susceptible to having their miners taken, the Hansa and Mecklenburg up here, as well as just it's hard to figure out like if Russia comes in, like how do they get to the French to do any damage? They'd then be waiting for the mandatory peace to end with Austria, in which case we're going to be headed towards the Peace of Amiens time period, where we switch to the imperial period, and really Russia will have not. Suvorov's time will have passed. The Russians will have really lost their ability to affect the game because we defeated Austria outright. We didn't put a buffer in with the Campo Formio Treaty. So things are looking pretty good for France, but when you calculate all the victory points and all of that, it's not as though we were reaching like an automatic victory by any means, but the French player is in a very comfortable position as they get their production. While they can't save recruitment points, they can certainly use their recruitment points to top off any weakened units. They can also look at buying additional event markers as the optional rule, which I'm playing with, to help get the things that they really want. If they pay 2 recruitment points, they can pick an event marker that will make sure that we get the things that we need to stay strong and transition again into the imperial period, as strong as we can hope to be, with very little threatening our position in Germany or Italy for that matter. And yeah, so all right, that's it for that. So yeah, the next little bit here we'll be playing 1798 through 1800. We're going to update the event markers and all that good fun stuff. Um, and then uh, we'll be back. So this would be, technically speaking, the War of the Second Coalition period. Right now, France is standing strong. Okay, here we are at what is basically the end of the Revolutionary period. So the next turn would be 1801. Um, and when we pick up again, it's going to be the French player who has initiative for the rest of the game, basically. There might be a few things that change that towards the end of the game, but for a good long while, France is going to have the initiative. Now, the way this is all come down is actually pretty interesting. We did have the Egyptian expedition, which Napoleon was successful at and was able to conquer Egypt and has taken Syria from the Ottomans. However, it's a little weird in terms of this like little side box. Like, what does it stay this way forever? Is this like, okay, that's over and now we don't think about it much ever again? I don't know. It's going to be a big resource expenditure to try to do any other naval invasions down that way. There's not very many chits that are going to support it moving forward. Um, so the Ottomans got involved, some fighting down there, and then they got involved up here, and which was really interesting that they eventually, some pushing with some French armies in the Balkans, uh, pushed into Venice. So we actually had Venetian, uh, Venetians under the boot of the Ottomans, I guess, and the Ottomans were sitting in Venice. They were going to try to get into Mantua, and they never quite had the movement to do it, or the capability to siege out properly, taking control of the fort. A whole bunch of back and forth stuff was going on, and really even the French forces had to fight Austria that had well, okay, so let me adjust a little bit. For a turn there, Austria was still under a peace, and so Russia didn't have many avenues to get into the action, but they did ship via naval capability into Mecklenburg and the Hansa, where those are considered minor allies. So they could land, and they could land and start to pressure in northern Germany. So there was some initial Russian fighting up here that kind of went back and forth. And at one time, the Russians were entering into this region up here, even pushing the French back, which was starting to look dangerous. Eventually, the French were able to kind of take care of that stack, and the Russians regrouped in Russia. And when the mandatory peace ended with Austria, the French had to deal with Austria and Russia. Now, by the time that Suvorov could come up to bat, the French had focused pretty intently on shutting the Austrians down. Um, and as the war progressed, it basically just wound up being Suvorov, picking up various scattered Austrian forces with Russians fighting France, some back and forth there, really interesting sort of tactical decisions about how to move and the move order and what would that mean for everything. Eventually, Napoleon sacrificed a bit to come down into Venice and clear the Ottomans to take pressure off Italy, and then came back up into Austria, and then Suvorov kind of held at Vienna. And at the end of all of this, right, there's a lot of dice being thrown here, a lot of different activities, lots of back and forth, some interceptions that the French player, expended some of their markers for interception attempts and succeeded with Napoleon. And that kind of changed the math a little bit in a couple of areas. All told, what we wind up seeing here is Napoleon in Vienna with another leader, some armies. Suvorov basically down to a step of an army outside of Vienna when the end of the turn hit. And ultimately, what I was expecting was that Austria was going to surrender again, which would have been really interesting because now we start to get into like mandatory alliance territory And that would be a pretty intensive game shift at that point. But the possibility of Austria being allied to France, and I'm not sure how we want to adjudicate that either. Austria still being in the revolutionary period, maybe being overthrown in like an Austrian Danubian republic. That'd be really interesting, wouldn't it? Um, or Napoleon marrying, Marie Louise early. Who knows, right? Hard to say. Um, but we didn't get that actually. Amazingly enough, like it was roll a one or a two, and Austria does not surrender at the end of 1800. Well, that's what we rolled, and Austria is not surrendering, which means as we get into the 1801 turn, we're going to see some Russian buildup and some Austrian buildup. Austria is going to be able to build up here, or besides Vienna, obviously. So that's going to be one aspect that's going to get looked at. We also are going to have the Russians. The Russians can build up some steps in this army with Suvorov. The rest will have to be built back here, and they're going to take a slower time getting into the main front here. So, kind of an interesting tactical situation to deal with. Will Napoleon be able to, you know, take out some of the coalition forces now that he has initiative, especially? He could jump forward, knock Suvorov out, and then kind of spin around and knock the other Austrian armies out. And I think, either player, maybe even the coalition player, would almost rather the Peace of Amiens come out, than to see Austria get converted to a French ally at, this early in the game going into the 1800s. So it is interesting, when you play from 1792, there's obviously this potential that the game is really going to be wacky by the time you get late in the game because so many things could have gone differently. You almost expect that. Well, this is where that's going to maybe start to come up. So if the Peace of Amiens doesn't take place, or if there's something goofy there, or maybe it's mandatory, I'm going to have to look at that. Uh, we could actually see that. I think Napoleon's in a fine position where, because he has supply, he can build up his army forces and be able to have a very general advantage here, where he could even choose to split off the other leader and the other army to go take Prague while he destroys the Russians and then goes on marches on Budapest. All that's feasible. We've kind of got a lock down here where, just because of the maneuver, the requirement to do a naval invasion across the strait, we're having to give up a whole unit here, though it's only a two-step unit, to hold Naples basically, and for the British to hold Palermo. Um, so a little bit of a gridlock there. Uh, there is a possibility that the British could have stopped the Egyptian expedition because they did have a chit that could block a naval invasion, but the French had this extra chit that I was going to navally invade Gibraltar as the French, and the British blocked that. And that's really a weird thing. Like, again, if this were an opposed game, you wouldn't necessarily be sure what markers your opponent had. I just figured, well, okay, there's some calculus here. I don't want the French to have Gibraltar because that's going to have really big, long-lasting effects in the game. So the possibility of losing Gibraltar was unsustainable, so we blocked that, and then the dice just sort of went the French way in the Levant, and Egypt and Syria fell. Um, there were a number of times where, like, it looks like, again, the French are coming out ahead out of the War of the Second Coalition, if you want to consider that based on the time frame here. Obviously, the fighting could continue. I'm going to have to look to see how the Peace of Amiens actually is handled here. Just the big thing I would say is, at various points, it's hard to tell at the end of every 3 year period, but at several points within the 3 year period, the coalition, came very close to overrunning the French position. And even at one point, there were actually Russians in Paris, and Napoleon rushed to kick them out. That's the other thing I should have mentioned early. When the Russians joined, they landed at Cherbourg because of some Chouans rebels came here, made that a friendly port. They came in, were able to come in. Maybe they shouldn't have been able to come in there because the Russians should only go through the North Sea and Baltic. But whatever. It maybe I'm getting a couple of things wrong along the way here, guys. I don't know, but I'm trying to make it, keep it interesting throughout. So don't think this is like France is just overrunning everything. There have been several points where France was coming to an unsustainable position. They did manage to kind of eke it out on die rolls eventually. Napoleon versus Suvorov have been interesting because it's led to a lot of like even die rolls, like both +3 and just whoever's going to roll higher is going to matter here. Towards the end, it just came to a really lopsided die roll where the coalition rolled a 1, +3 is 4, okay. But then like the French rolled a 4 and +3 is 7, and like just that amount of difference mattered a lot. And it's just been luck that kind of kept maybe even Napoleon from getting run over in Bavaria by Suvorov, which would lead to maybe a very different looking end state here where, Italy's really empty. Napoleon's pushed back to southern Germany or even Strasbourg, with Suvorov, in pretty good shape, and then the Austrians this year being able to rebuild and being able to support. So that'd be like, even on maybe one or two battles, the game state would look very, very different, where the French position's almost about to be lost in its entirety. We're still pretty spread out, right? We've got to have some steps in Paris just in case. We're holding that Italy position. We've got a force over here just in case Spain gets converted to a British ally, or any other goofy business. So it's tough balancing the like, you don't want to take everything out of France proper. You got to leave some stuff behind. You got to look to see where the plugs are that need to, or the weak points that need to be plugged up. And then, as expected, Italy and Germany tend to be the fronts where the big decisive battles are going to determine is one side kind of falling back into their own territory. When it's really counted across all the die roll modifiers, the French have managed to kind of eke out the advantage here. So it is playing a little more, I'll say a little more balanced than my first playthrough. I also think I was playing wrong here, much more even if we're going to see some French advantage if Austria can't liberate itself or liberate Vienna in 1801, or the peace occurs, which is going to kind of reset the board a little bit as we transition to the full imperial period. So having fun. There's still always places in the rules where I wish things were clearer. I'm having to kind of like make sure every step of the way, like, am I looking in all the right places for the real rule here? Is there something else going on that I need to take into account, and all of that? But still fun. It's fun. Now, there's something that's going to happen here. I should also mention, like Suvorov is as good as Napoleon. I'll grab the unit counter so you can see here. Um, they're equal. So that's the dream fight, right? The dream match that history never really gave us. Um, in this game, we're seeing it happen, and Napoleon's sort of the winner. The bummer for the Russians is, the situation's not going to get better for the coalition. Suvorov exits the game this next turn and is replaced by Kutuzov. Kutuzov is a fine leader, but he's not as good as Napoleon just on the face of it. So where, maybe if they were keeping Suvorov, um, this fight in Austria would be more interesting. I'm thinking without Suvorov, the coalition just is not going to be in a very strong position to survive this. The only goodness being enough French steps have been lost that full production probably won't cover all of the French losses, or it's going to be topping off. Um, so that's the calculus that we're working through. Anyway, kind of a long one, guys. I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut the video here and just call this the Revolutionary Period video, and then we will look to pick up on the Imperial period, at least 1801 and beyond. You can kind of consider this still the Revolutionary period for these next three turns, but the 1800s proper, 1801, we will start covering in the next video, and we'll cover as much as we can there. We might get to 1811 or something and do another cut depending on how long the video is. So just a couple of videos covering the full campaign game of Pitt's War, Struggle for Europe. But it's a gas. It's fun for what it is, a magazine game, zoomed out. It's still some interactive systems and lots of unknown things that could come up and shift the game state. So anyway, we'll see you in the next one, guys. Take care. Keep gaming.